President of Tallan's cloud practice, and I'm going to be presenting today an Azure Governance Overview. This has been a topic that's come up a lot over the last year or so, and a lot of people just, they're trying to figure out the what, where, who, why about Azure. So we're going to start out today by talking about why do people have governance and what do you need a governance model for? And that's just in general terms. And then we're going to go into how Microsoft Azure controls governance. We'll talk about management groups. We'll talk about Azure policies and initiatives. We'll talk about Azure Blueprints. We'll stop and take some time around cost management and then the resource graph. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a baseline to go through, and if you have an Azure environment already, start to implement some of these governance policies, start to learn a little bit more about cost management, a little bit of blueprints in the resource graph, and kind of how to get around. And if you haven't, these are things that if you're starting to adopt Azure, that you want to think about as you're starting to adopt it and as you go through your whole governance agenda. So why governance? And the reason why is governance needed, and this is something that's been needed throughout the years, whether you were in the cloud or on premises or wherever you were, because there's always pressure now to digitally transform, do things better, faster, cheaper. There's a lot of people that are looking to shift to DevOps, and with all of that happening in the cloud, you get a lot of what we call cloud sprawl. And this is partially because the cloud, one of the great things about the cloud is you can go in, you can spin up your own resources, you can kind of do whatever you want. But then on the other side, that's the bad thing, because as you start to do that, they're traditionally on premises, you only had, 10 servers and it only had so much capacity. With the cloud, you quote unquote have unlimited capacity. So you can start to spin things up and do things and not really have to worry about capacity, not worry about things. And a lot of times we have a thing where people have left the water running, where they spin up a machine, they do something with it, they say, oh, that was real cool. They kind of forget about it. The machine's still sitting there, it's still running, it's still getting charged for. So as you start to implement your governance policies, you can start to reduce all of those things. So the traditional approach to governance was there was the developers, and this is in terms of doing application development. There was the developers that wrote all of the code. The developers handed it over to the operations team, and the operations team would kind of look at it, make sure everything was done well, it was monitored, and then it was given to the engineers responsible for deploying it, and it was out in the cloud. And this was kind of the traditional approach. And what people are shifting now is going to native cloud governance, and where that way before you didn't have as much speed, but you had a lot of control. That it went from one person, it went to the next one, it went to the next one, and you sacrificed speed for control. When you start to talk about cloud native governance, you can get speed and control, where you can have the developers, you can have the people that are doing the monitoring, and instead of going from person to person, that the developer does one thing, the operations people do the next, you can have the operations people put plans and controls in there and policies to have workflows set up so that when a developer is ready to do a deployment, he or she can put these deployments through these pipelines, through these workflows, and all of the things that the operations team is looking for, all of the controls are all built in there. All of the stuff that the developers are looking for, the speed, is all built in there. So as they go through and do this, they have guardrails set up so that you can kind of bump into them. If you do something that you're not supposed to, it stops you from doing it and you can keep on going. This in turn, it makes sure that all of your checkboxes are checked in terms of security and compliance and all of that. So some of the policies may be that you can't spin up certain size machines or you can't spin up certain resources. That keeps all of your costs in control. And then the last part is the pipeline of how things are deployed so that you don't have developers or operations people going in and saying, all right, this is going from development to QA. I need to go in and change these configuration files. I need to do this. I need to do that. It's all built into a pipeline so that the code will go from the developer's repo, whether you're using Git or whatever, and have a pipeline that the code is pulled from there, built, deployed, and pushed through all of the environments. So governance for the cloud, we're going to start to talk about governance for the cloud and specifically for Azure. And Azure has the some platform capabilities built into it that ensures compliance and control around the resources. The first is Azure policies, and this does real-time enforcement of different things as you're trying to deploy them. You can put policies in there that say you can't spin up a virtual machine with more than 4 cores. So if somebody went in and tried to spin up a virtual machine that's more than 4 cores, the policy, it'll try and spin up the machine, it'll run it through this policy and say, hey, you can't do this, try something else. So that's the first part of it. The second part is blueprints. And this is something that is made after something's already deployed and update cloud environments, and it lets you do it in a repeatable manner. So a lot of places, a lot of companies that we work with, what they're doing is they build out their environment and then create blueprints from them so that in event of a disaster, or if they wanted to create a new environment, say they had a development environment, a QA environment, and a prod environment, and then they said, oh, we really need to do user training, so we want to add a user training environment. They can take the blueprints of that dev or QA or production environment, and it will kind of stamp it out so that you can build another environment that's exactly the same as the one that's in production. And it's just a templatized way of creating new environments to ensure that all of your environments are all the same. The next part of Azure governance that we'll talk about is the resource graph. And this is an API into Azure that lets you interrogate Azure many different ways in terms of resources, in terms of cost. It gives you a lot of visibility into what's going on inside of your Azure environment. The next part that we'll talk about is Azure management groups. And this is a hierarchical organizational structure that you can start to apply the policies that we made over here. You can start to apply them to management groups. And it's a way to make sure that all of your, if you have, if you were doing product development and you have 6 different products, you're most likely going to have a dev environment for each of those products. You can create a development management group, apply policies to that, and then all of those environments that you say are underneath this development management group, they're all going to have all the same policies applied to them. So it gets the hierarchy of your environment, and it will again make sure that they're all the same. And the last part that we'll talk about is the cost monitoring inside of Azure. When Azure first came out, there was a product called Cloudin that it was a third-party product that you could buy and monitor the costs inside of your Azure environment. Since that's come out, Microsoft has actually bought them and is incorporating all of the Cloudin cost management stuff inside of the Azure portal now. So a lot of people will ask, how does the whole Azure governance architecture fit together? And so the first part of it is the environment factory, and it lets you deploy, update cloud environments in a repeatable manner. And that's what we just talked about with Azure Blueprints. So the second piece, once you have your blueprint, you can have policy-based controls, which are real-time controls, let you start spinning things up, don't spin things up. When something is spun up, make sure that something else is spun up. All of that is done through the policy engine. And that works along with the Azure Resource Manager. So Azure Resource Manager, if anybody is familiar with ARM and the ARM templates, you'll submit a template. It will run through the policy engine, make sure that it's okay, and it will either succeed or fail from there. And then the last part of it is the resource visibility with the Azure Resource Graph. So you can query anything inside of the Azure Portal, third-party tools, and you can see what's going on there. So the architecture that we're putting together is you would try and create a virtual machine, storage, network, resource provider, anything. It'll run through the Azure Resource Manager, check all of your policies. If everything's good, it'll be deployed out to the portal. If it's not, it'll stop you from doing it. From there, you can use Azure Resource Graph to start to monitor things that are in there. And you can use Azure Blueprints to be able to stamp out environments and create them as you see fit. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today is all up on Microsoft's website, and here's a couple of links to it, and we'll send these out after the presentation. But this is the Azure website is a phenomenal resource to go in and look at all of these. If it's not like the old things where a lot of this stuff now is really kept up to date. And you can see as you start to go in these, you see all the last updates on all of the Azure governance stuff. It's always within a couple of days because they have people that are continually updating the documentation around all the governance stuff. So the first thing we're going to talk about is management groups. And management groups in Azure, a lot of people will ask, is a management group and a subscription the same thing? And no, it's not. Although they look the same, they're not the same thing. So a management group is a logical grouping, and it can apply to subscriptions. And it's a logical grouping that lets you put things together that logically fit together. You can use inheritance for management groups, and you can actually aggregate them down to the subscription level. So as you start to put together all of your subscriptions, there are a lot of people that do them. They will do a dev test subscription, they'll do maybe a QA subscription, and they'll do a production subscription. And they may have multiple production subscriptions for different business units or different products. So as you start to look at how your organization is organized and managed, then your logical grouping of how your organization is managed is usually how these management groups fall into place. And what you do is you create the hierarchy. And the good part about this is it's flexible, and it doesn't necessarily need to go along with your organizational billing hierarchy that you may have in your enterprise agreement. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but you can start to be flexible with it of how you want to organize things, because things may not be organized in the same way for security as they are in terms of billing. I think that the organizational hierarchy can go 6 levels deep. Most of the times we see people that are doing 3 and 4 levels now. As you start to go into 6 levels, it can get a little bit hairy. The last part is the apply governance and controls with policies and access controls to these things. So you can use Azure policies, you can use RBAC controls. All of that stuff is available within management groups. So here's a basic setup of a Microsoft recommendation for how you would set up management groups and subscriptions. So there you have your organizational management group, which is your top level. This one on the left-hand side is production, and on the right-hand side is pre-prod. So with this inside, there's 4 subscriptions in here. So you can go in and apply policies at this prod RBAC, and all of those policies and RBAC rules will be applied to the production stuff that's sitting in the production management group. And anything that is pre-prod will be applied to all of the ones on the right-hand side. Here's another representation where somebody was dividing it up by business unit. So they would have their root, and then they would have a marketing team management group. They would have an IT team management group. And then under the IT team, have infrastructure and application teams. So in this type of layout, you could have policies at the root that will apply to everything that's under here. Then, the marketing team, they may have their own policies that don't apply to IT. IT will have some overarching policies that apply to infrastructure and app dev. And then there may be some other things that are more fine-grained that just apply to the infrastructure team and just apply to the application team. So as we go through here, you can apply a policy at the application team, and there may be some policies that you could apply at the application team and the marketing team, but might not be applied at the infrastructure team. So these are just a couple of different ways that we see people are laying out their management groups. Typically, this is said by business unit, which is marketing IT. The other one was by production and non-production. The one other thing that's not in this slide is when people are doing product development. They may have management groups for each of the products that they have developed. So one of the things that a lot of people are doing now inside of Azure is the role-based access control, where you can do fine-grained control of Azure resources at RBAC roles. This is the one thing that when Azure first came out, it was lacking a little bit, and now it's definitely caught up to the likes of AWS and all of the others with the RBAC controls. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is the Azure policies and initiatives. And so we first started out by talking about management groups. Management groups are your logical groupings of how you're going to put in your subscriptions. And then you're going to start to apply these Azure policies to those management groups. So what are they for? And Azure policies are real-time policies that are mostly used for enforcement and compliance of when there's some of our customers that are using these, that there's one customer that we have that they're just using Azure for the data tools. They're building out a data warehouse or all of their data warehousing. So they don't have any use for any of the IoT tools or any of the virtual machines or any of that stuff. They're just using the platform services for data warehousing. So what we did for them is we created a policy that only lets them create resources that are of the certain types that they wanted to create. So inside of the Azure Portal, you can create hundreds of different resources. With them, they have a policy that says, hey, you can only create these 8 or 10 different resources. The other thing that a lot of people will do with these policies, they'll they'll go through and, if you're starting out with Azure and you have to ask your IT team, say, hey, I need an Azure subscription. A lot of our customers will say, okay, you're going to get a subscription. It's going to have a virtual network on it. It's going to be connected back to our network with a site-to-site VPN. It's going to be an extension of our network. So the IT team will use a Azure Blueprint to create that initial subscription, give it to you to use, and then most of the time, they will go in and create policies that say, hey, don't let them create another virtual network. Don't let them create another site-to-site VPN. If we already created a key vault for you, don't let them create another key vault. So it's another thing of putting controls around what you're trying to do and what you give your people access to do. And with these Azure policies, they can get down as fine-grained as, hey, don't let Ryan create this SKU of this VM. So they can get very fine-grained. They can get pretty complicated if you start doing them that way, but you can go all the way down to a person creating a resource of either allowing or not allowing them. And one of the things that's nice, it allows you to do the policies at scale. As I said before, with some of our customers, they are, they only want to be able to create certain resources. That's across their entire Azure account. So they know that they're never going to have somebody spin up a virtual machine that might be hacked into, that's sitting on a network that's not really secured down correctly, because they have policies set up to stop all of that. So how does an Azure policy work? There's a user that'll write some code around an Azure policy, and a lot of the stuff inside of the policies is just JSON that you go in and use Microsoft's language to create the policies. From there, it will ask for a resource config request, and it'll run through those policies. It'll inspect, the policies will be inspected, and then it'll say, hey, you're good to go, or you're not. And so as it's inspecting that policy, it'll run through and it'll say, hey, does this person have access to create this certain resource? And if it doesn't do it, it doesn't, if it's not good, it won't let you do it. And then goes through and everything looks okay. Your cloud resource is created. And a lot of people, we get asked this question all the time, is, sometimes somebody will go through and they'll walk through a wizard of creating a virtual machine. And, it may be an 8 or a 10-step policy of putting in all of the parameters to create that virtual machine. The web UI in the Azure portal isn't smart enough to start to inspect these policies as you're going through creating the config for a virtual machine or for any resource. So what it's doing, it will go through, you'll step through or have your scripts that will go through and create a virtual machine and go through the 10 steps. It packages all of that up and then sends it to the Azure Resource Manager to inspect the policy. The policy inspection, as I said, is all done through the Azure Resource Manager, not inside of the portal. So if you kind of come across that and go, man, I went through 15 steps and now it tells me, no, I can't do this. The reason why is because the portal's not smart enough to be able to go in to start to inspect policies on the fly. So there's one other thing with the policies as you start to go. Some of these policies you can put in, and if there's something that was created prior to the policy, it can go back and it will go back and say, hey, these two resources are in compliance with the policy. This last one is not. So sometimes as people start to create policies, they realize that they want to be more strict now than they were before, especially in in a environment that has no policies, it will go through and remediate all of the ones that you had out there before. So the policy language, as I said before, it's a lot like it's a lot of JSON. So it's a lot of if then else is, if this resource is of type whatever, or field name or accessors is within these values, then let them be created. If not, don't create them. So as I said before, you can, a lot of times what people will do is create a bunch of very simple policies and chain them together rather than trying to go and create a very complex policy. And all of these policies, they can be created inside of the portal. They can also be created with PowerShell. So, if the field name, then if the field name is not in here, or this one's saying that if a tag does not contain if it doesn't contain a cost center, then don't let them deploy this policy. The person don't let them deploy this resource. So the person who is trying to deploy this resource would need to go back in and add a tag that says which cost center this resource is tagged to. So once it has a cost center, it'll be deployed, and then you can start to go through and use the cost management and filter on tags to see how much stuff costs. So there's another policy that's out there that you can enforce naming conventions, that if you want things named a certain way, if the field name doesn't have a name prefix and name suffix, then deny the creation of it. And these are all things that you can put in there. You can get as creative as you want with your policies. And this last one was one of them that I was talking about. That's a very common one that's used, of allows certain VM SKUs. Is, if this one's saying that if a virtual machine is not a basic machine, A1 through A4, then don't let them deny it. This one is super effective because you can spin up some really, really huge VMs that will start to cost you tens of thousands of dollars a month. And what we've seen here is that, especially if you do it for developers, they're always saying, yep, we just want the biggest and best thing that's out there. So you can deploy policies that will only let them create certain sizes. And this last one is a policy where you can enforce VM SKUs by using parameters. So there's some of them where you can, that last one, the one back here, all of these were hard-coded in here. When you start to do these things, you can also send in a parameter list that has a list of allowed SKUs. So you could have a file out there that had A0 through A4 like the last one, and change them on the fly so that you can enforce things with parameters. So a lot of the things that we put in here, there's recommended policies that we see people using all the time. And one of the policies that we always, whenever we go and set up a new Azure environment, we'll usually lay down anywhere from 6 to 24 policies. But the first one is making sure that blob storage always has encryption enabled. Same thing for file storage. SQL data encryption should always be enabled. Same thing with SQL threat detection. VMs should always have anti-malware. A lot of times people want their VMs to use managed disks. Another one that comes up all the time that people just kind of forget about is they create a storage account and it's open to the public network. You don't want to do that. And for ExpressRoute, deny all public IP addresses. And you can go through. The great thing about a lot of these policies that are coming out now is there's a lot of them that are inside of the Azure portal that are built in for you that you can just start to use. There's also a bunch of different libraries that have policies that are already written that you can just kind of go and I don't want to say steal, but you can go and take them. They're public knowledge. They're just things that people do all the time. So Azure policies, best practices. We always ask, what drives your needs for a policy? Most of the time, regulatory compliance, cost controls, standards, and enforcing design principles. So a lot of times people ask, who owns the policy definition of the implementations? And usually these policy definitions are made up between a lot of the definitions, if it's security-based, the policy is made up by the security team. If it's design-based, it'll usually be made up by the cloud engineering team. And then the engineering team is usually the one that will go and lay down all of these policies. And we've seen a mix of who actually responds to things when they are not when they're not enforced. So if it is a security thing, then the security teams can be in charge of it. If it's a design principle, then the cloud architects or the cloud engineering. But a lot of these policy definitions, whenever we work with our customers, it's always working with the cloud team and the security team. Some of our customers, that's the same team, but other larger corporations have two separate teams. So it's a melding of those two. What's involved in designing a new policy or refining one? And a lot of it is research into what people are doing. The one mistake that we see people making all the time is that out of the gate, they try and make a whole bunch of policies and lock everything down, and they really don't fully understand what's going on. And they'll go through, and one of the things with the cloud is you want the people that are using it to be innovative, and you want to have that speed and control in it. But when people will go through and lock everything down right at the beginning, it almost stops people's creativity. So you have to really watch what you're doing in terms of policies. And a lot of times when people are starting to adopt Azure, they'll be a little bit laxed on the policies just to see what people are doing, and then start to create policies to stop people from doing things that they know they shouldn't be doing. But when you try and figure it all out at the beginning, it seems like it backfires on you a lot, because you might go through and create a whole bunch of policies, and then you see that nobody was even trying to do that in the first place. And then other things that you didn't think people were going to do, they're doing all over the place. And that's where you really need the policies. And as I said before, there's a whole bunch of policies inside of the Azure portal. So if you come into the Azure portal, you can go and see the policies that all happen out of the box. And there's things that are all different categories. You can see on the right here, there's regulatory, security, monitoring. You can set up all kinds of different things. So next, we're going to jump into Azure Blueprints. So just to kind of recap, we went through management groups. Management groups have policies applied to them. And Azure Blueprint is now going to be the blueprint of the environment that you're building that has policies applied to it that's in a management group. So this is a case study, a kind of name change to protect the innocent of Cloud Factory. And their cloud challenges was there was no central way to compose or enforce what goes on or made available in a subscription. Challenging to set up foundational infrastructure. Subscription owners can modify resources, remove policies, break best practices, and no way to codify best practices. So as we start to talk about these, challenging to set up foundational infrastructure architecture, cumbersome to create and redeploy infrastructure. There was a lot of times when Azure first came out that somebody would build an environment and say, all right, here's our development environment. We're ready to go to production. and then they had to go and try and recreate the environment just as it was in development by hand. And it was painful because it almost never came out the same. And how many times can you say about your on-premises environment that it's exactly the same way as it is in production? 99% of the time it's not, especially if it's not scripted or you're not using something like Chef or Puppet or Ansible. Those products are just another way of doing blueprints. There are, we have some customers that are using blueprints. We have some customers that are using one of the third-party tools. It's just Microsoft's wrapped up way of doing, of like an Ansible or a Chef or Puppet. So when we start to talk about introducing the blueprint solution, the first part of it is composing, is making your environment the way that you want it to be. And that's a lot of the Azure blueprints are just what we were talking about, like the policies, they're just JSON scripts. It says, this is going to be a virtual machine. It's going to be this size. It's going to have these disks. It's going to have all of that. So it's just a codified way of creating an environment, and it lets you create it in a repeatable manner. The next part of blueprints is you send it through the orchestrator, through the ARM templates, and it will deploy all of your resource templates, your policies, your RBAC models, so that there's no kind of human intervention or no human touch in here that will make sure, and that will ensure that your stuff is coming out the same. The next part of it is locking down your foundational infrastructure that are shared across subscriptions. You can go through and say that I've deployed this with an Azure Blueprint. I'm not going to let somebody delete this virtual network that I created, or I'm not going to let somebody delete my virtual network and my domain controllers. That is the stuff that has to stay there and has to be the same all the time. So you can go and let them create and destroy other virtual machines on the thing, but you really want to lock down your foundational infrastructure. And then that's where it brings out the empowerment of letting people build their Azure environment in a self-serving way, but it's still giving you the controls and the lockdowns that you had of your traditional infrastructure. And if you think of it, as much as things change, they kind of all stay the same, because in the on-premises days, the infrastructure team, they would never let you go in and fool around with a network. They would never let you go and do something to a domain controller, but they would give you virtual machines. They would give you all other stuff. And this is exactly what we're doing here, is we're able to have locked down the stuff that needs to be locked down and give everybody else the free reign to go through and empower them and let them be creative to build out their environments. So how blueprints work. The cloud engineer is going to create a blueprint. From there, they're going to add artifacts, Azure resources. They can create policies, templates. You can put things from the Azure Marketplace in there, build out whatever environment you want and however you want it to look. And then you want to look at how things are going to be instantiated and deployed, and your sequence of deployments that things are going to go through. It's going to apply all of the policies and the RBAC and the templates first. And then from there, the blueprint will be scoped to a subscription or a management group, and it's created and secured. So what are some of the things that we get to do here? Is Azure Blueprints are letting you deploy and update environments in a repeatable manner, and it's all done with code. So you compose it with role-based access controls, policy definitions, ARM templates. You throw it through, and it's managed in the Azure Blueprints. And then the great part about it is, as you do these, you can start to deploy environments at scale. You can have an Azure Blueprint and say, hey, we fixed this, or we're creating a new environment. I want to go through and in subscription A, make my development subscription, subscription B, make my QA subscription, subscription C, make a training environment, subscription D is my production environment. That way, you know that all of your machines in your whole environment are going to be the same exact thing across the 4 environments. So the last thing here is some of the things that the requested scenarios is to do have cost visibility per blueprint. These are some of the things that Microsoft is working on now. The ability to create subscriptions while assigning a blueprint to it, and integrate blueprint assignment with subscription creation experience. And these are some of the things that all of this is. These slides are a bit old, so I think that the first one is already in there, but some of these other things are the things that Microsoft is working on. And for those of you that don't know, there's a thing that Microsoft has called user voice that you can go through and request different things inside of Azure, inside of Office 365. And if there's a request that's out there that somebody else has already requested, you can vote on it. So you can vote it up to see if they'll work on that next. And that's one of the things that Microsoft is using on a day-to-day basis to figure out which features should go into Azure and Office 365 and Dynamics next. They'll look through that user voice, see what people are asking for, see how hard it is, and they'll put that into their backlog and keep things rolling. So the next thing here is the Azure Blueprint screen inside of the Azure Portal, and this will get you going on the Azure Blueprints. The next thing that we're going to talk about is the resource graph and cost management, and this is one that we know that the developers almost never care about, but the CFO always cares about. Because I see our CFO on our call, and I know that I get queries every day of, how can we cut down the Azure spend? How can we cut down the Azure spend? So going through with the resource graph and the cost management, this will let you do it. This is start to show you different places inside of Azure that you can cut things down. So what the resource graph lets you do, it lets you do ad hoc exploration of the entire cloud environment. One of the things that cost management has in it now is you can actually do cost management of AWS from inside of Azure. So you can use the cost management piece, connect it to an AWS resource, and it'll give you a single pane of glass for all of your AWS and your Azure resources. But it'll let you look at them. It lets you run queries against different things, and then assess the impact of what's going to happen like long term. And one of the things that we can talk about here is this is one of the pains of the cost management window inside of Azure. And it will give you the accumulated cost of your resource as the month goes on. So you can go through and you can slice and dice it many different ways. So you can go through and see this is a little bit small, but the categories, it's $3,000 for Store Simple, $1,500 for virtual machines, $34 for storage, $20 for data services. You can start to see all of your different things in your cost projection of what we're looking at. You can set budgets in here inside of Azure Advisor so that as things start to get close to the budget, it'll start to show you an overage of where you're going to go over. And we always talk about the cost optimization, and it's something that has to be done continually, because you can't just put something out there and then hope for the best. Your cost optimization of your cloud environment is always going to be done by the management team, the finance team, and the technical team. by providing your visibility in there, you know, the Azure Cost Management will give you all of your visibility. And then it's always the finance team that's always holding you accountable to how much your spend is. This comes into play, especially if people are doing software as a service that they're selling out to other people, because, you know, how do you know how to charge for something if you don't know how much it costs for you to run it? So seeing these things, being able to control your costs in that way, that gets you the most profitability out on the other side, and you start to optimize things. You can go in and see that if you start to look at machines inside of the resource graph and say, hey, this machine is really never going above 5% on CPU. I could probably make this a smaller machine, save myself money, and it's going to run faster. So this is a continual circle that just keeps going and going and going. And there's never, I can probably say that there's never an environment that is fully optimized at any time. It's always changing with customer needs, with times in the economy. So this is, like I said, this circle, you're continually doing this. So this is what we were talking about before, of bringing it all together. For those of you that have enterprise agreements, there is an enterprise portal that'll show you how much you've spent each month against your enterprise agreement. And then, as I talked about before, there's cost management by Cloudin that is looped into the Azure portal now. So what used to be out here in the enterprise agreement portal is now brought into the Azure portal so that anybody can have access to it. You can start to see what things cost on an individual basis. You can see what things cost by resource group, by tags. It's a great way to provide visibility into it for everybody that's working on it. As we talked about before, there's some cost analysis stuff in here. You can filter it by groups, you can filter it by date ranges, and like I said before, you can slice and dice things many different ways to get the cost management pieces that you're looking for. The next part here is all of your cost management data. You can export it to a storage account, and the storage account gets all integrated into the cost analysis so that you can start to pull it out and then slice it other ways that it does inside of the portal. And what a lot of people are doing now are starting to use the Power BI content pack to be able to start to look at all of their costs through Power BI and not just through the management portal, so that the higher level management can look at costs through Power BI and not have to have access into the management portal. And as I said before, you can do cost management across clouds for AWS and Azure. So you can hook up your cost management inside of Azure to your AWS subscription and start to look at it in one spot. So the keys to accountability is one of the things that we always talk to people about is extending the visibility to stakeholders, making sure that whoever's in charge of a management group has visibility into it. Whoever's in charge of a subscription has visibility into it, and make sure that they set clear goals. That, you know, we think that this subscription is only going to cost us $1,000 a month. So then you can set alerts if it starts to go over $1,000 a month. And then you can really hold the teams accountable for the improvement of it. Because a lot of times when this first came out, people would say, oh, well, I spun that up, but I didn't really know how much it cost. How was I supposed to know it was going to cost that much? Now they don't have that excuse anymore because everybody sees the same thing. So what we're gonna jump into a little bit of a recap now of what we talked about with the management groups to organize subscriptions. So we're going to go through and we're going to create your management groups to organize the subscriptions. And all of this stuff is going to have all the people that have view into that management group will have views into the subscriptions that are in there for the accountability part. And then the RBAC roles that are important in cost management, there's cost management reader, contributor, billing reader, and then the reader, contributor, owner. These are the ones that the different personas that you can assign to the different people inside of these roles. The next part that we were talking about is tagging to add context. As people start to go through, depending on how you have your subscriptions arranged out, you can put tags in there. So you can put cost center tags, environment tags, business owner tags of who's accountable, and then you can start to look at cost by business owner, look at cost by environment, look at cost by cost center. Many different ways that you can slice and dice it. You can go through and set up budgets for monitoring and notification. If you see a subscription that for the last 6 months has been burning through $800, set a budget of $800, $900 so that in 2 months, if they start to burn through $1,100 after 3 days, you're going to know something's wrong in there and somebody needs to take a look at it. And as we start to talk about cost optimization, you want to go through and make sure that you're always looking to see if your resources are fully optimized for what you're doing, making sure that your CPU, if it is going, only 5% for 23 hours a day, you probably could make that machine a smaller machine and work it that way. So the last part that I wanted to talk about is Azure Advisor. And what Azure Advisor does, it provides optimization recommendations in terms of costs, high availability, security, and performance. So as it'll show you different things around if things are right-sized. It will show you if things that typically are highly available or not. If there's things going on with security that you should have different things locked down, you can do that, and it'll also help you optimize your performance. And all of the Azure Advisor stuff is built into Azure, and it's of no extra cost. So the first scenario that we have is tracking costs for departments and environments, and this is different hierarchies. And it usually, as we're talking about billing, these mimic the hierarchies of the management group sometimes, and sometimes they may not. But these ones are, all of these subscriptions are all rolled up to this enterprise agreement. All of the business unit 2 are rolled up to that. So all of these subscriptions are costed by the departments and the environments that are under them. You can start to break up your different cost management and look at it by department or by environment. There's a second scenario here that does departments, subscriptions, and resource groups. So you can do cost tracking by a resource group. And a lot of times when people will ask, I get what a department is, I get what a subscription is, how should I use resource groups? And Microsoft's recommendation on resource groups are things that are deployed and destroyed together should be in the same resource group. So if you have an application that has a web server, it has a database server, it has, a queue, it has all these things, those should probably be all inside of the same resource group. This one is broken out that there's a UI project and a database project that are broken up into resource groups. You can also do it that way. But typically things that are deployed and destroyed together land in the same resource group. And that way you can have some very fine-grained cost controls and policies around your applications. One of the things that a lot of people say is, as you start to do all of these cost cutting techniques, you start to reinvest your savings, is start to take other things that may be in a co-location data center that's costing you money, migrate it to the cloud, start to modernize and reinvest your money in making your applications a little bit better. And the one part where people always start to do is reinvest their money in the security and management of the applications and make sure that you're taking advantage of all of the added security that the cloud will give you. So with that, we're going to wrap up here. And the one thing that Tallan can help you with is, getting started today is help manage we could help and do an Azure assessment where we can come in and look at your Azure environment and see if your costs are in line with where they should be. A lot of people are starting and have been using Azure Reserved Instance and hybrid use benefits. If you don't understand what that is, please reach out to myself or to Ryan. I'm sure he'll be calling you back in the next couple of days. You can, if you have a machine that is going to sit there and run for a long time, you can use reserved instances and pay up to a third of the price of having something day by day, hour by hour. So and as I said, these Azure assessments that we come in and help people, we've helped them on environments that have been up and running for years already. Or if you're new to Azure and want to start an Azure environment, we can also help you there of getting started on the right foot and not making a lot of the mistakes that we've seen other people make right from the get-go. So for more information on this, there's a bunch of different pieces inside of the Azure website around cost management, API reference, fast track for Azure. If anybody's used the fast track team, they can help you get your deployments up and running, most of the time free of charge with Microsoft funding. So where we go from here, as we start to talk about, we can go through, Tallan can help you with an Azure assessment, help you get going with your Azure environment. And a lot of these, people say that, we've built our Azure environment and we're not quite sure if it's right. So, we can help you with that piece too. So with that, I will wrap it up, and I only went 2 minutes over. So if anybody has any questions, please, Ryan will be reaching out to you in the next couple of days. If you have any questions about this, he'll reach out. You can get in contact with him, and we can hopefully start a great relationship here. I will stop now. And did anybody have any questions?